Hey there, it's summer here in Southern Ontario and actually, in the Northern Hemisphere. But summertime is our time for recharging, relaxing, taking a break, taking like that mental break. But also, it's our time for some relearning. What we do here in Make Math Moments is we have our book list that we kind of go through throughout the summer and look at what we can do to make some improvements, do some new learning. We got a book list here for you. We want to share it with you. Let's go. Hey there, Math Moment Makers. John here from Make Math Moments. And if you have not yet subscribed here on YouTube, hit that button, hit that bell so that you can get notifications when we have new videos just like this one. And in this video, we've got a special two parts for you. Two parts. We got one is we're sharing with you our ultimate book list for math educators. It's the list that we go to read and recharge and rethink some of the lessons and the ideas that we are using in our classrooms. We're going to share that list with you. So if you're looking for some summer reading, this is the list to go to. And at the top of that list is a book that is relatively new. It's about a year old now. It's from Peter Liljedahl, and his book is titled Thinking Classrooms. It's our go-to book. It's one of our favorite books this year to read and to use in your classrooms. And as a special bonus in this video, we're going to share a clip of a video that Peter and Judy Larsen did in our 2020 virtual summit back in November. They submitted an interview style video where the two of them talk about how to get started in thinking classrooms, what are the pitfalls, what are the things we should be thinking about, all of these kind of great tips for you in the classroom. So we're going to share that with you in just a few moments, and then afterwards we're going to share some resources of how you can watch the full video, but also where you can get that book list. So that link will be in the bio section, wherever the information is below the video. So here's that video. Enjoy.
My name is Peter Liljedahl. I'm a professor of mathematics education at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. And I'm the author of the recently released Corwin book, Building Thinking Math Classrooms.
And I'm Judy Larsen. I am an associate professor at the University of the Fraser Valley, where I teach math courses and teacher education courses. And I'm very fascinated and connected to the Thinking Classrooms framework.
So last year at the virtual summit, Judy interviewed me about thinking classrooms. This year we're going to turn the tables and I'm going to interview Judy about thinking classrooms. So I like to introduce Judy when we do workshops together and so on. I like to introduce Judy as the person on the planet who knows more about thinking classrooms than anybody other than myself. But it wasn't always like that. So Judy, why don't you tell us what is thinking classrooms and what was your journey into thinking classrooms?
So the Building Thinking Classrooms framework is a set of 14 practices that have emerged from observing classrooms and studying different aspects of breaking down the institutional norms that occur. And you can read more about it in Peter's book and on Peter's website. For myself, my first introduction to it was a little bit of a shock. It was in 2011. I was just starting grad school, and I was not expecting to come into a room that was disorganized and tables were all over the place, and Peter wasn't even in the classroom. He walked in right when the time started and told us to all get up and come over to the corner and showed us a math trick, a card trick. And as a fresh grad student, I was expecting to take good notes and sit and listen and soak things in. I was not expecting to get up. But after that initial shock, I started implementing the three main practices that really are the foundation that a lot of people recognize the thinking classroom as, which are using vertical whiteboards around the room and having random groups, visibly random groups, and good problems, to begin with good problems. So those were sort of the foundational things that I started with in my teaching, and I thought, okay, this is thinking classrooms, and that's all there is, and it went well. Like, I was getting good feedback from my students, and yeah, it was all fine and jolly.
Until
and around 4 or 5 years later, I was starting my PhD program, and I was curious to know more about your research in it and to understand more about it. And so I started attending your workshops for teachers, and one after the other. Eventually, I think I came to more than 30 workshops and just sat in the back, or sometimes I engaged with the participants as well. And I began to realize that it's not just those 3 practices, first of all. There's way more, and there's way more nuance to the framework. So some of the things that I noticed right away, the first one I attended was in North Vancouver, and you were introducing flow, and this idea of stringing together sort of a sequence of hints and extensions that would keep and manage students in flow. And I really felt this as a participant in that workshop, and I also then was able to reproduce it in my teaching. Some of the other things I started noticing was just how important working the room was, and how the pace of that happened. The way that you introduced the task, and then you would really build that energy. First you would wait in the center and watch everyone kind of organize, and then you started really just like moving the energy around the room as you paced through each group in different patterns. So that was really fascinating, because that was not really written about anywhere. It was just something that I experienced, and then I was able to kind of take into my own teaching.
Okay, so, but those first 3 practices are part of the Thinking Classroom framework. And if you've learned all 14 practices, you also learn that you can't implement all of 14 of those at once. And that when you do begin implementing Thinking Classrooms, those 3 ones that you had learned about first are actually the first 3 practices that get implemented in the classroom. And the idea of flow doesn't actually get implemented until much later. Mm-hmm. It's if you're implementing them in sequence, it's the 9th practice that gets implemented. If you're implementing in chunks, it lives inside the 3rd chunk, or the 3rd toolkit, as it's so called. And as Judy mentioned, you can get more information about this in the book or on the website buildingthinkingclassrooms.com. Okay, so Judy, you mentioned you did your master's with me. Your master's was on flipped classrooms. Then you came and did your PhD with me, and you defended your PhD last November. So can you just tell us a little bit about what was your PhD about?
Yeah, so it ended up being focused on the community MITBoss that is on Twitter. It's under hashtag MITBoss, which stands for Math Twitter Blogosphere, and it is a collection of math teachers who communicate through Twitter online.
How'd you get interested in that topic?
So I got interested in that topic because I was interested in professional learning as a broad sort of space, and then within that, moments of collaboration and moments where new ideas were generated. And that's really what I was chasing in this space was, when are these new ideas generated? I was also really fascinated by this community in particular because when I started digging into talking to the members and going to some of the sort of physical meetups that they would have, that there was a lot of discussion about how this is the best professional development ever. So Twitter is the best professional development ever, is what I heard time and time again. And so I was curious.
I've heard that too, yeah, and I've read it on
yeah.
Twitter under the hashtag.
Yeah. So I was really curious why, and if so, how.
Okay. So it was at this time you're spending endless hours in going into the rabbit hole that is MITBoss,
yeah,
and reading all of these tweets and so on and so forth, trying to understand how MITBoss is such a powerful professional learning community. And at the same time, you're hanging out in all of these workshops on Thinking Classrooms, 30, I think it was, and you're also implementing Thinking Classroom in your own teaching at the university. And I think you were also starting to bring some pre-service teachers into thinking classrooms, and you were also visiting some thinking classrooms with me. So what do these seemingly very different contexts have in common? So you got Mitboss, which is an entirely asynchronous online community, or at least what's happening that you're studying is asynchronous and online, and contrast to these face-to-face thinking classroom environments that you're spending time in. So what do these communities have in common?
So I'd say it comes down to negotiation, or opportunities for negotiation and collaboration and generativity and synergy, like the energy of coming together around sort of a common goal. But there's also a decentralization of there's no sort of central authority that dictates what anyone is to do. It's all sort of emergent. And
okay, I could see that in Mitboss, but the thinking classroom has a teacher in it. The
Yes.
teacher is a central authority.
Exactly, but it aims to decentralize the authority of the teacher. Like the way I see it, everything you're doing is you're trying to, not be at the front of the room and you're becoming part of the context of the space. It's almost like, so in Twitter, somebody set the constraints of what is possible, the range of possibility in Twitter. Somebody said, you can retweet, you can reply, you can do these things, but there's a limitation on that. Whereas in a thinking classroom, you're part of the context and you're setting those constraints. There's also density that's different. So it's almost like the density in Twitter. There's so many people on Twitter that someone is bound to sort of take that lead role on, but it's always a different person. Whereas in a thinking classroom, you are the sort of central organizer, but you're not in the center. You're kind of pushing it from the back.
Right. So I just want to add a little bit of context to this. So Judy's the one who gave me this vocabulary of decentralized control in a thinking classroom, which is not something that emerged explicitly. So the thinking classroom research was about trying to find practices that generate thinking, that get students thinking, and so on and so forth. And never along the way did I do research on centralized or decentralized control. But if you start to think about what's happening in a thinking classroom, of course the teacher's setting the task and the teacher's setting the pace and the teacher's deciding when they're going to consolidate. But also there are things, external constraints, like the bell is going to ring at a certain time and the school has provided the classroom teacher with a space to do this work in and so forth. So there are these external controls, but inside of this, there's a huge amount of decentralizing of control and putting more and more responsibility on the learner.
Yeah, so I mean, how you answer questions, you're just sort of passing on that control as you do it, right? You're trying to bounce off the thinking and have it go back into the learning space. You also have just the way you're acting in the room. You found results around the different organizational structures in the room of where the teacher is, how organized the space is. The more sort of messy, the more thinking happened.
Yeah.
So these sorts of nuanced things that the teacher does actually set the constraints for a strong sort of student-focused community to emerge.
And we spoke a lot about that last year. And incidentally, if you want to listen to that recording from last year, you can go to buildingthinkingclassrooms.com/podcasts and you'll find that recording there. Okay, so let's get back to this, because this was one of the things that when I was living in this space with you was incredibly fascinating for me, because although I was leading the thinking classroom workshops and you were the sort of fly on the wall, we spent a lot of time unpacking those sessions. Likewise, you were the one who was leading the research into Mitboss, but I, as your supervisor, we spent a lot of time unpacking that spaces. And one of the things that we found was, although these spaces are seemingly different contextually, there turns out to be a lot of similarities between them. And this was tremendously helpful to me, because thinking classrooms was what I call results first research. And what that means is that I was looking for what I call optimal practices. These are the things teachers can do that are most effective at generating student thinking. And these were organized around 14 questions, so to speak. And for example, early on in the research, we found that students were most productive and did more thinking, and more students thought, when we had the students work on vertical whiteboards, or vertical non-permanent surfaces, we called them. And that was a result that emerged very clearly. But there was no explanation for why that was the case. We had the result long before we had the explanation. And I was, at that time, when you were spending all this time in these workshops, I was still busy trying to find explanations for some of these results. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about what were some of the things that you learned in MITBOS on Twitter mm-hmm. that helped us explain what was happening in Thinking Classroom, and vice versa. What were some of the things that you were thinking or seeing in Thinking Classrooms that was helping you explain what you were seeing in MITBOS?
Yeah, so the thing about the vertical non-permanent surfaces is that it kind of allows for this reification, or like a trace to be made on the whiteboard in sort of a local, comfortable space for students. But it's just, it's there for others to see. And so that's one thing I think, even from feedback from my students I've had, is what they value about is they can see all the different ways other students are working. And in a sense, that happens on Twitter. You have these sort of tweets that are floating around that you randomly interact with or find, and then choose to reply or retweet and act with, either passively or actively. And so something that happened early on when I came to one of your classes was we were doing a problem. I think it was the moat mm-hmm. and the two pieces of wood. Yeah. You have to get across the moat, but neither piece of wood is long enough to reach across the moat. Exactly. And so students were working on it and drawing it out, and there was just sort of a stall for a little while. Everyone was just staring at their little moat picture and thinking about their pieces of wood. And at one point we were both standing there in the center, and within a flash of a second, the solution just traveled across the room, as if the room knew. And so it really just started in one place, and people would look over and see it, and then because it was such a visual solution, unless you see it, you're not able to really construct it, and then it just traveled around the room. And so I would see these things happen on Twitter as well, right? You'd have some sort of task that was super pop, maybe a math mistake, or a which one doesn't belong, or an open middle type question, and it would just sort of become super popular very quickly, and it would catch a lot of attention. And so this sort of visibility aspect is one place that I think the mobility of knowledge is something that I see in both spaces. Another thing that I was really curious about was the moments of negotiation, so the moments where generativity of ideas comes in and like novel emergent material happens, which is really learning, right? Like that's when students co-create a solution. And so because I was interested in that, I was seeing that in the workshops, in classrooms. I was curious how this was happening on Twitter. And there's, I started digging into the places where negotiation was happening, which it wasn't very prevalent. It was less prevalent than I would expect. Twitter is kind of a negotiation depleted space, but there were moments where somebody would post an example. I think there was a math mistake that I analyzed, posted by someone with, a lot of followers, and so everyone saw it, and there were several threads that kind of kept going, and not only did they talk about the mistake, the math mistake, they started generating new materials and new activities and resources that they could use with students for this mistake. And so what I noticed in those threads was the places where the negotiation really went on were the places where the two people talking, which usually it was 2 or 3 people conversing with each other, they had a lot of sort of shared experience when you look into them. And like, I knew about the community members, and so they have a lot of sort of shared redundancy. And so that allows them to communicate. Like, you have that shared experience, so you're able to communicate. And then you layer on, they also had diverse perspectives on it. So the places where there was redundancy, they kind of got to a place and then stopped because there was no new diversity to keep them going. But the places where they were redundant and diverse in their thinking were places where new material would happen.
All right, Math Mo Makers, John back here after that video, and that was just a clip. That video is about an hour long, that interview, and the two of them continue to talk about some of the things that they've learned along the way and the elements of the thinking classroom that Peter describes in his book. And if you're looking to watch the full video, you can watch that full video as a member of the Make Math Moments Academy. You can get free 30 days. All of our virtual summit videos are in the Academy. So not just Peter's and Judy's, every one of the 36 different sessions we had in 2020. And also we had about 25 different sessions in 2019. So lots of learning. That's like full years of professional development inside the Academy for just the virtual summit, not to mention the courses that we've put in there that you would also have access to, and the full teacher guides for all the activities. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So if you're looking to dig deeper in the thinking classrooms, consider hitting up our Academy. All right, that's it for me. If you've not yet subscribed here on YouTube, do that before you head off here so you can see our next video. And be sure to check out the summer reading list in the links below. Take care.